So today's lecture is going to go over part 1 of chapter 13. This is a pretty popular part of the textbook Imagery. I think a lot of us are aware of what imagery is, or at least have an idea. But now what we're going to do in this chapter is really talk about a little bit about the research that's been done with imagery, but also how do we utilize that in sports psych. So some objectives. We're going to aim to understand the evidence of imagery's effectiveness, try to look at where, when, and why athletes might use imagery or imagine things. Excuse me. We're going to talk about how imagery might influence performance, look at the factors that influence the effectiveness of imagery, and understand the theories and be able to differentiate between the theories of imagery and understand the guidelines for using imagery with others. So it's a lot. That's why we're breaking it out into 2 sections, but just hang tight and we'll get through this, all right? So the first one here, kind of a broad question. What is imagery? I think everybody's got kind of their own definition of this. But when we're talking about it, you might think of things like visualization, mental rehearsal, symbolic rehearsals, covert practices, so again, kind of mental practices, that kind of stuff. But really what imagery is it's just the act of creating or recreating an experience in your mind, and that's going to be key. It sounds a lot easier than it actually is. Now this last bullet point that's on here is a link to a YouTube video. This YouTube video should take you to a clip from The Legend of Bagger Vance, but it does kind of a really good job of just giving you kind of an example of what we might be talking about with imagery. Now there's lots of movies that reference imagery. Things that come to mind are I'm pretty sure Happy Gilmore does it, the Cool Runnings does it, that kind of stuff. So imagery is a pretty common thing, but I think this clip is in particular pretty good. So check it out when you get a second. So kind of the big question with this is, does imagery actually work? And we have really 3 ways of looking at that. There's anecdotal reports. You can talk to a lot of athletes, and this has been done a great deal. And generally we find that a lot of people talk about using imagery or how they were able to just visualize their performance before they did it. So that's one way of knowing if it works. Maybe not the most objective form, but again, it's still one form. There have been case studies done, and the book chapter goes over a bit of those case studies. So again, another outlet of finding out if people are using imagery and if it's working for them. And then lastly, there have been a number of experimental studies that really look at, can we manipulate things, can we give people training or provide some sort of intervention with imagery skills, and does that ultimately influence their sport performance? So probably one of the most common or popular ones out there is this PETLEP imagery model. So this acronym, each thing here hits on an element of what we believe to be an effective way of using imagery. So we have a physical component, the environment, what is the task, so being able to see the task that you need to do, the timing that's involved, learning, so you can use imagery to learn skills or just stay proficient in skills, emotion, so being able, again, to become more self-aware and what kind of emotions should you be engaging in, and then lastly, the perspective. And we'll talk about that a little bit more, but perspective really talks about, are we talking about a internal or external perspective? And in our imagery script. So when we think of internal perspective, think of Call of Duty, think of Halo, where it's you are in the body, you're seeing what the person would naturally see or what you would see if you're going through the motion. Whereas an external perspective is going to be kind of if you were out of your body watching yourself do some movement or some event. So some of the experimental studies that have been out there, I wanted to talk about this one in particular. It was by Wright and Smith in 2009. They wanted to look at, again, that acronym, so the PETLEP imagery, and see how creating an imagery script might influence strength performance. So they got 50 college students, randomly assigned them to one of 5 different groups. So one group was just given physical practice, and I believe these were just on bicep curls. So one group got to go into a gym and they would practice bicep curls. Another group did not go into a gym, but instead was given a imagery script. So what it would walk them through what it feels like, what the gym looks like, that kind of thing. But they're not actually in the gym, and they're not actually doing the actual bicep curls. The third group was, again, the imagery script, and they were in the gym. So it's that combo that they were given. Then there was one that was just a written imagery script. So all it was is they were given a sheet of paper explaining what the experience of bicep curls would feel like. That's a little different than the Petlep, because they would actually walk them through, okay, close your eyes, think about the gym, all of these things, instead of just handing them a sheet of paper. And then the last one was just a control group. So they weren't given any experimental condition, they weren't given any practice or anything like that. It says bicep curls here. That's just, again, I didn't mean to make that a sub-bullet there, but that just is to give you some frame of reference of what they were supposed to be doing. Okay, so what were the results? Which is pretty interesting. So when we look at the control group where they weren't given anything, we have the pre-test and post-test. There's really no difference. Okay. If we look at the traditional, so this would be just handing them a written script. There's a little bit of a difference, but not much, not a significant difference here in their performance. If they're actually given the opportunity to just go into a gym and practice, there's a significant improvement. If there's a combination with the imagery script and the actual physical practice, again, this is an even greater difference, so that would be a more significant result. And then if just using the Petlep model, again, there was quite a change. So this kind of demonstrates that imagery is not a bad thing. It's definitely not going to hurt someone's performance. But if we're not actually utilizing some of the key components of imagery, or not using imagery at all, then we're not going to see some results. Okay, so that's what we kind of have here. So it's just saying traditional and control group showed no improvements. Petlep combo group significantly improved. So did the Petlep just imagery group. So the idea again here is using the Petlep model as well as physical practice is going to show improvements in performance. Okay. There's also, I kind of mentioned it before, but the types of imagery, so that internal perspective and an external perspective. Internal perspective, like I said before, it's kind of a weird way of thinking about it, but think of Call of Duty or video games where you are actually in, the screen is actually that person's perspective. Sorry guys, quick edit to that video that we were just working on. I've added a link to a YouTube video that'll give you a better idea of this. It doesn't have anything to do with video games, but it's actually a video of some mountain biking in Peru where they have an HD camera that really gives you the perspective of the person biking and what they would see. So this is that internal perspective of visualization or imagery. An external perspective, though, is think of it as like someone videotaping your performance and then you watch it later on television or something like that, where you are actually outside of your body. You're getting that third-person perspective. So, I mean, we have these two perspectives, so which one's best? Well, it's kind of up to the person. So internal imagery on closed tasks and external imagery on open tasks really just talks to the idea of an internal perspective is best when something's closed, when it's something we need to think about or doesn't have a lot of external stimuli. But if we're using an external perspective, that might be useful if we need to be able to take in a lot of information or environmental cues. So you could think of like a quarterback. They're going to want that external perspective so they can see the rest of the field and see all kinds of different information. And that isn't always best suited by an internal perspective. So the research is kind of back and forth on this, which is going to be best, but ultimately it's going to be up to the athlete or the individual and what works best for them. So some of the research that's out there, we'll talk about performance enhancement, the nature of the task, the skill level of the participants. So this gets at, are they elite level or just kind of recreational sport participants? And then also, what about your ability to use imagery or recreate images in your mind? So when we're talking about performance enhancement, some work's already been done, and basically what's been published states if you're using imagery effectively, it's going to influence performance, and generally in a positive way. There have been tons of papers published on this, so this is kind of just a quick take-home message trying to show that imagery can influence sport performance or physical activity behaviors. Some other elements. I don't know where my, oh, there we go. So why might imagery influence performance? The book does a good job. It's going to go over in depth each one of these. But if you're using imagery, you're probably going to be attending to things or improve your concentration. You usually are going to go through an imagery script that kind of bolsters how you feel about the activity and stuff, so it might actually enhance your motivation. It'll build confidence, control emotional responses. So again, think of imagery as an opportunity to practice skills and your emotional response. The next one, like it says here, to acquire, practice, and correct sport skills. I think that's pretty straightforward. It's another method of practice or ways to alter your practice strategy. It allows you to prepare for competition, so that way you're not caught off guard or put in a situation you're not prepared for. It also can be used to help you cope with pain or maybe some stress or some type of adversity. And ultimately it can help you solve problems, right? Because now you're not just dealing with a novel situation, but instead you've practiced things, you've visualized things, and you've played out in your mind potential outcomes. So what are some factors that influence imagery effectiveness? Well, that's going to talk about the nature of the task. So if it's something that involves a lot more cognitive components, so a lot more thinking, decision making, or perception, then we know that imagery or that imagery really works well for this. But when we're talking about external components, that gets to be a bit more dynamic, right? Because we can't always account for every situation. The next one, ability level. A lot of research has basically found that it doesn't really matter if you're new to sport, if you've been doing sport a long time or physical activity for a long time, imagery can help in both cases. And then there's this last element of combining imagery with practice, and this is definitely important, right? So we've talked about this kind of stuff before, in that you don't always just want to do imagery. You don't just want to do a psychological skill. It usually helps to put it into practice and actually putting it out on the field and seeing how it's working and evaluating if that imagery script or whatever psychological skill you're working on is effective for the athlete. Imagery ability. So of course this is going to be extremely important, right? And there's been a lot of work that's looked at this. These are 3 broad studies. I believe the first one is more of a review of studies looking at people's ability to use imagery and does it actually influence a performance if someone believes they have a high ability to imagine situations. Clearly, if you can be more vivid in your imagery, so if you're able to basically use all 5 senses and recreate something in your mind, that's going to be a lot more effective than someone who has trouble imagining what a soccer field looks like. Okay? But these are things that can be practiced, and these are just some studies that, again, they're more big picture studies, so check them out if you have some time, but they will give you kind of that big picture of imagery ability. One questionnaire that's out there is the Movement Imagery Questionnaire. This is the revised edition, but what it does is it's a way of figuring out where someone's imagery ability is. So The instructions kind of go as followed. Read, listen to each statement carefully, and then actually perform the movement as described just once. Okay, so I've got a few examples here. A lot of these questions are going to get at one of two things. So they kind of stick to one core element or another. So one is to just form a clear and vivid visual image of the movement that you're trying to perform. And then the second one is to attempt to recreate that feeling of doing the movement without actually moving your body. Okay, so, and then what the person does is they're going to rate how easy or difficult it was for them to recreate that feeling in their mind. Okay, so here are the two components. So a person might rate how easy it was to recreate the visual image of going through a movement, but then they will also rate how it feels to go through that movement without actually creating the movement in their body. Okay, so here's a few examples. So you might have a starting position, stand with your feet and legs together and your arms at your side, and then we're going to do some kind of action. So you might ask the person to raise their right knee as high as possible so that they're standing on just their left leg. Okay, so the right leg should be bent, so you're kind of looking like a flamingo. Now lower your right leg. Okay, and now you're back to standing on 2 feet. And then, so that's the actual action. And then what you do is you put them through a mental task where they actually just think about recreating that movement and what it feels like to do it. This is another example, but this one is jumping in the air. Okay, so again, standing on the ground, bend down low, jump straight up in the air as high as you can and land. And then recreate that in your mind. And then they would report whether that was easy or difficult for the creation of the visual image or the feeling. So that's the end of part 1. We're going to keep going with imagery though. So when you have a moment, go to part 2 of our lecture on imagery. Thanks, guys.